She warned me not to marry him. Only after the wedding did I learn she was protecting someone else entirely. I want to start with the exact words she used, because I've never quite been able to shake them, even years later. We were standing in the corner of my own engagement party, a glass of champagne warming untouched in my hand, when Thomas's great-aunt Cecilia leaned in close and said, quietly enough that no one else could hear, "You should think very carefully before you marry that man." Then she smiled, patted my arm as though she'd simply complimented my dress, and walked away before I could ask her a single question. Hello, my name is Julia, and this is the story of the strangest warning I ever received, delivered by a woman I barely knew, at the happiest moment of my life, and the truth I didn't uncover until nearly a year into my marriage. A truth that had nothing to do with my husband's character and everything to do with a promise made to someone neither of us had ever mentioned. This isn't a story about a woman trying to protect a bride from a dangerous man. This is a story about a sister named Margot, a promise made at a hospital bedside decades earlier, and the particular kind of love that would rather be misunderstood forever than risk breaking a fragile trust it had spent a lifetime building. I think you should understand, before I describe that party, what kind of man Thomas was, because I don't want you to imagine I ignored some obvious red flag out of naivety. Thomas was, by every visible measure, exactly the man I wanted to marry. He was kind in the unglamorous, daily ways that matter more than grand gestures, patient with my large, chaotic family, generous with his time in ways that never seemed to cost him anything he minded losing. Cecilia's warning was the single discordant note in an otherwise clear and steady picture, which is exactly why it lodged itself so deeply in my mind. I grew up in a large, loud, easy family. 4 siblings, holidays that spilled over into every room of my parents' house. The kind of upbringing that leaves you assuming, without ever quite examining the assumption, that love is mostly simple once you find the right person. I mention this only because I think it shaped how unprepared I was for a warning that came wrapped in no context at all, no explanation, no evidence. Just a single sentence delivered quietly, and then withdrawn behind a polite smile before I could ask a single follow-up question. Thomas and I had met 3 years earlier, at a mutual friend's dinner party, and dated for 2 years before he proposed on a quiet evening at the small Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. His family was warm and welcoming from the beginning. His parents both gone by the time we met. His only living close relative, a great-aunt named Cecilia, who had helped raise him after his mother's early death and who he clearly loved, though I noticed, even before the engagement party, a certain careful distance in how he spoke about her, an affection tempered by something I couldn't quite name. I asked Thomas about Cecilia's comment the very night of the party, expecting some reasonable explanation, an old family rivalry perhaps, or simply an elderly woman's blunt sense of humor gone slightly wrong. He went quiet in a way I had rarely seen from him, told me Cecilia could be unpredictable, and asked, gently but clearly, that I not take it too seriously. I let it go that night, chalking it up to nerves and champagne, and the particular strangeness of large family gatherings, though I want to be honest that the words themselves never fully left me. I remember lying awake that same night, running through every possibility I could imagine, wondering whether Cecilia knew something about Thomas's past I didn't. Some old relationship gone badly, some financial trouble, some family rift that had never fully healed. None of the possibilities I invented that night came anywhere close to the truth, though I want to be honest that the not knowing itself was its own particular kind of difficult, a low hum of unease that never quite disappeared, no matter how many reasonable explanations I offered myself in its place. I saw Cecilia perhaps 4 more times over the following months, at increasingly smaller gatherings as the wedding planning intensified, and each time she was warm, even affectionate toward me, never once repeating the warning directly, though I sometimes caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between worry and a kind of private, unreadable calculation. I remember mentioning it once to my own sister, describing the strangeness of a warning that seemed to have no follow-up, no explanation, no evidence to support it. My sister suggested, reasonably enough, that some older relatives simply enjoyed being cryptic, that Cecilia's comment likely meant nothing more than a general old-fashioned unease about marriage itself, and for a while, that explanation was enough to let me stop turning the moment over so often in my mind. There was one particular evening, about 4 months before the wedding, that I still think about often. Thomas had received a phone call during dinner, stepped into the next room to take it, and returned nearly 20 minutes later looking pale and distracted in a way I had rarely seen. When I asked if everything was all right, he told me it was just a work matter, nothing serious, and changed the subject quickly enough that I noticed the deflection without quite naming it as one. It was only much later that I would understand those calls, infrequent but recurring throughout our relationship, had never once been about work at all. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who has ever received a warning they couldn't verify, from someone who refused to elaborate. I think there's a particular kind of unease that comes not from evidence of wrongdoing, but from the simple absence of an explanation, a blank space the mind can't help filling in with its own quiet worries. I chose, in those months, to hold that blank space with as much patience as I could manage, trusting that whatever it contained, Thomas himself had given me no real reason to fear the worst. We married in the early autumn, a small, warm ceremony that Cecilia attended, dressed beautifully, tearful in the pew in a way that struck me, even then, as more complicated than ordinary wedding sentiment. She hugged me tightly afterward, told me she wished us every happiness, and I remember feeling, for the first time since that engagement party, that whatever fear had prompted her original warning had somehow been resolved, or at least set aside. The full truth arrived nearly a year into our marriage, on a Saturday morning when Thomas's phone rang early, before either of us had properly woken. I watched him answer it, watched his entire posture change in an instant, and heard him say, with a gentleness I had never quite heard him use before, "I'm on my way. Tell her I'm on my way." He was dressed and out the door within 10 minutes, telling me only that he needed to handle something urgent, that he would explain everything that evening, and asking me, with a seriousness that startled me, to trust him just a little longer. He came home that night quiet, drained, and finally, at our kitchen table, told me the truth he and Cecilia had been carefully protecting for the entire span of our relationship. Thomas had a younger sister, Margot, 4 years his junior, whom he had never once mentioned to me. Margot had been born with a severe intellectual disability, the result of a rare complication during birth, and had required lifelong specialized care that Thomas's parents, and later Thomas himself alongside Cecilia, had provided with a devotion so complete it had shaped nearly every major decision in both their lives. He told me that Margot lived in a small, well-regarded residential care community, 2 hours outside the city, a place their mother had chosen carefully before her death, and that he visited her every other Saturday, without fail, a ritual he had maintained since he was in his early 20s. He explained that Margot's understanding of the world was fragile and easily disrupted, that she had experienced, over the years, a series of painful losses, their mother's death, their father's decline and eventual passing, a beloved longtime caregiver who had left the facility for a different job, and that each loss had required months of careful, patient work to help her feel steady again. He described, too, the specific texture of those Saturday visits, how he had learned over the years to bring the same small bag of things Margot loved, a particular brand of peppermint candy, a stack of picture postcards from places he'd traveled, that he would describe to her slowly, letting her ask questions for as long as she wanted. He told me he had missed only a handful of those visits in over 15 years, each time arranging for Cecilia or a trusted staff member to explain his absence carefully in advance, so Margot would never be caught off guard by an empty chair where he usually sat. Listening to him describe it, I understood that this wasn't an obligation Thomas quietly endured. It had become, over the years, one of the steadiest and most cherished rhythms of his entire life, a devotion so consistent that missing it, even once, felt to him like a small betrayal of a promise he'd made to himself long before he ever made one to Margot directly. In other words, what I had mistaken, for nearly a year, as an unexplained tension in Thomas's family history, was in fact an entire second life he had quietly carried alongside our relationship from the very beginning, a devotion so consistent and so carefully protected that he had never once considered burdening me with its full weight until he felt certain, completely certain, that our marriage could hold it. He told me, too, about Cecilia's role in all of it, how she had been Margot's primary advocate since their mother's death, visiting weekly, managing every detail of her care with a ferocity that had earned her a reputation within the family as fiercely protective, almost to the point of severity. He explained that Cecilia's warning to me, delivered at our engagement party, had nothing to do with any doubt about my character or Thomas's. It had everything to do with a promise Cecilia had made at their mother's hospital bedside, years before I ever entered the picture. A promise that Margot would never again be asked to trust someone new, love them, and then watch them disappear, unless that person had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, they intended to stay for good. Cecilia had watched, over the years, two of Thomas's previous relationships end precisely because the women involved, kind as they were, couldn't fully embrace the reality of what loving Thomas would eventually require: the weekend visits, the long-term planning, the quiet, permanent presence of a sister who would need lifelong care and who formed attachments slowly and painfully. Both of those women had, at various points, met Margot briefly, formed a warm, early bond with her, and then vanished from her life when the relationship ended, leaving Margot confused and grieving a loss she couldn't fully articulate. Cecilia had made a private vow after the second such heartbreak that she would never again let Margot be introduced to someone who might not stay, and my engagement, arriving quickly and warmly, had triggered every one of her carefully accumulated fears. Thomas told me about the second of those relationships in more detail than I'd expected. A woman named Renata he had dated for almost 2 years, whom Margot had grown especially attached to after nearly a dozen visits together. When that relationship ended, Margot had asked about Renata for months afterward, unable to fully understand why someone she'd trusted had simply stopped appearing, and it had taken nearly half a year of careful, repetitive reassurance from Thomas and her care team to help her feel steady again. Cecilia had sat with Margot through several of the hardest of those weeks, and Thomas told me she had come to him afterward, quietly furious in a way he had rarely seen from her, and made him promise that the next person he introduced to his sister would be someone he was certain, beyond any reasonable doubt, intended to stay for the rest of his life. I asked Thomas gently why he hadn't told me about Margot much earlier in our relationship, long before any warning became necessary. He told me it wasn't distrust of me specifically, but a hard-earned caution, born from watching Margot's heart broken twice before by people who had loved her sincerely in the moment and still, eventually, walked away. He had decided, somewhere in our first year together, that he wanted to be entirely certain of our future before introducing me into a bond that Margot, once formed, could never fully be protected from losing again. Cecilia's warning, he explained, had been her own attempt to test the same certainty from the outside, a blunt, imperfect gesture meant to give me one last chance to reconsider before Margot's fragile trust was ever put at risk. He told me he had nearly told me about Margot on several occasions before that. Once during a quiet weekend early in our relationship, once again the night before he proposed, each time pulling back at the last moment, afraid that the timing wasn't yet certain enough, that revealing something so precious too early might risk it being treated carelessly, even unintentionally. He said that carrying that secret alone had been one of the loneliest parts of loving me, wanting desperately to share the fullest version of his life, and holding himself back out of a promise made to protect someone even more vulnerable than either of us. Hearing him describe that particular loneliness, the ache of loving two people fully, while being unable to let them exist in the same room, helped me understand that his silence had never been about protecting himself. It had cost him something real, every single time he chose it. I sat with Thomas at that kitchen table for a long while after he finished, turning over an entire year of small, unexplained absences, distracted phone calls, and a warning I had never been able to fully set aside. I felt no anger at all, only a quiet, growing tenderness for a man who had guarded his sister's fragile heart so completely that he had been willing to risk his own relationship's early trust rather than introduce her too soon. I met Margot for the first time the following weekend, at the care community 2 hours outside the city, Thomas introducing me carefully, slowly, watching her reactions with the practiced attentiveness of someone who had learned, over decades, exactly how to read her comfort. Margot was warm and curious, delighted by small things, a woman with a laugh that filled the entire visiting room, and I understood, within minutes of meeting her, exactly why Cecilia had guarded access to her so fiercely. Loving Margot, even briefly, clearly asks something real of a person, and losing her love, even accidentally, would have cost her something no apology could easily repair. She asked me, almost immediately, whether I liked peppermint candy, and when I told her I did, she insisted on sharing the small bag Thomas had brought her, carefully counting out exactly half for each of us, with a seriousness that made Thomas smile in a way I hadn't seen before, soft and unguarded. She showed me a small collection of postcards taped along the wall above her bed, each one from a place Thomas had visited and described to her in detail, and told me, with obvious pride, that she knew the names of cities she would probably never see herself, but could picture clearly because her brother always told her exactly what the light looked like there, exactly what the air smelled like, exactly what people wore on their feet. Before we left that afternoon, Margot took my hand and asked, with a directness that startled me, whether I was going to keep coming back. I told her yes, as steadily as I could manage, and watched something in her posture visibly relax, a small, private relief that told me more about the years of loss she'd already carried than any explanation from Thomas or Cecilia could have. Walking back to the car, Thomas told me quietly that it was the first time in years he'd watched her ask that question of someone new, without also flinching in anticipation of the answer, and I understood, in that moment, exactly how much weight had been resting on a single visit I hadn't fully known, until then, was any kind of test at all. I want to tell you what happened after that first visit, because I think the slow unfolding of it matters as much as the year of quiet unease that came before. I began accompanying Thomas on his visits regularly, learning Margot's particular rhythms, her favorite stories, the specific way she liked her tea prepared. Cecilia, watching this unfold over the following months, gradually softened toward me in a way I hadn't expected, eventually admitting, over a quiet lunch, that her warning at the engagement party had been the hardest thing she'd ever said to anyone, and that she had spent the following year quietly hoping, more than she let herself fully believe, that I would prove her caution unnecessary. I think about that entire first year of marriage often now, the specific ache of carrying an unexplained warning I couldn't verify, and I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who has ever received a cryptic caution from someone they couldn't fully understand, not every warning is evidence of danger. Sometimes it is evidence of love so carefully guarded, on behalf of someone else entirely, that the person offering it would rather risk seeming unkind than risk that love being broken one more time. I want to offer a few reflections. For anyone listening who recognizes their own version of this story, some unexplained caution or hesitation from someone close to the person they love that never quite made sense at the time. Know that not every warning is meant to protect you specifically. Some warnings exist to protect a third person entirely, someone whose vulnerability you may not even know about yet, and understanding that distinction can change everything about how you choose to receive it. Understand that people who have been hurt through someone else's departure often develop a fierce, sometimes misunderstood protectiveness that has nothing to do with doubting you, and everything to do with refusing to watch the same wound reopen twice. Give yourself permission to sit with uncertainty a little longer before assuming the worst. I could have let Cecilia's warning quietly poison my trust in Thomas over that first year. Instead, I chose to hold the question patiently, and that patience left room for a far gentler truth to eventually find its way to me. Learn to recognize that fierce protectiveness in someone else's family is not automatically a rejection of you. Cecilia's bluntness at my engagement party could easily have read as hostility, and for a while it did feel that way. But underneath it was a woman who had simply loved someone vulnerable for so long, and lost so much on that person's behalf, that she had stopped being able to separate caution from cruelty in the way she delivered it. Learning to see past the delivery, to the devotion underneath it, changed everything about how I understood her. Remember that a partner's caution about revealing certain parts of their life isn't always secrecy in the troubling sense. Sometimes it is simply careful timing, offered out of respect for someone else's fragile heart, someone who deserved to be protected until the moment felt truly safe. Recognize that love which asks something real of you, ongoing responsibility, patience, a willingness to show up on someone else's schedule for the rest of your life, is not a burden to resent, but often the clearest evidence of the kind of partner you've chosen. The very thing Cecilia feared I might reject turned out to be one of the deepest sources of meaning in my marriage. And believe, finally, that the people who love us most fiercely are often protecting far more than we can see from the outside. Entire private worlds of devotion built long before we arrived, and quietly carried alongside us the whole time. Sometimes all it takes is one honest evening at a kitchen table to finally understand the fuller shape of who they truly are, and who else they have always, faithfully been showing up for. Margot came to our home for the first time this past spring. For a small family dinner Cecilia helped us plan with meticulous care, choosing the menu around Margot's specific preferences, arranging the seating so she would feel comfortably close to Thomas without feeling crowded, walking through the whole visit with us twice beforehand so nothing would catch Margot by surprise. Watching Cecilia move through those preparations with such quiet precision, I finally understood the full scope of what she had spent decades building. Not just a caregiving routine, but an entire, carefully maintained architecture of predictability that made Margot's world feel safe despite everything unpredictable life had already taken from her. Watching Margot sit at our table that evening, delighted and entirely at ease, laughing at something small Thomas said, reaching for a second helping of the dessert Cecilia had made specially because she knew it was Margot's favorite, I understood completely why Cecilia had once been willing to risk sounding unkind at my own engagement party rather than let this moment arrive without absolute certainty behind it. I think, often, about how close I came to letting one unexplained warning quietly erode a year of genuine happiness, and I am endlessly grateful that patience, and eventually the truth itself, showed me exactly who Cecilia had been protecting all along. Cecilia and I have grown close in the years since, an unlikely but genuine friendship, built on the same fierce devotion to Margot that once made her seem, to me, almost frightening. She told me recently, over coffee, that she no longer worries the way she used to when Thomas leaves for his Saturday visits, because now, more often than not, I go with him. And Margot has stopped asking, even once, whether I intend to keep coming back. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.